The heavy wooden door of Providence Municipal Court swung shut with a solid, echoing thud. Judge Frank Caprio peered over his glasses, his experienced eyes carefully examining the young man standing rigidly at the defendant's podium. Jamal Williams stood with his shoulders hunched forward, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his dark hoodie, which he kept pulled up despite the courtroom's warmth. The air in the chamber felt thick and still, charged with unspoken tension that seemed to radiate from the teenager's defensive posture. The court clerk had just read the charge aloud, a red light violation captured by an automated camera at the intersection of Broad Street and Elmwood Avenue. The documentation showed Jamal's vehicle had entered the intersection 0.3 seconds after the light had turned red. The prescribed fine was $95, a significant amount for most people who came through these doors. Jamal's mother, Eleanor Williams, sat in the first row of spectator benches, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with anxiety. "I understand why I'm here," Jamal stated, his voice low and edged with defiance. He refused to make eye contact with the judge, instead focusing his gaze somewhere on the polished wood of the judge's bench. His body language communicated clear resistance to the entire proceeding, as if he considered himself above the court's authority. Judge Caprio observed the young man's tense posture, the way his jaw muscles worked nervously beneath his skin. He noticed how Jamal's eyes occasionally darted toward his mother, then quickly away, as if afraid of what he might see in her expression. Eleanor Williams watched her son with worried eyes that glistened with unshed tears. Her bottom lip caught between her teeth in a gesture of maternal concern. "Mr. Williams," Judge Caprio began, his tone measured yet firm, carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "When you disregard traffic signals, you're not just breaking a minor rule. You're risking lives, your own, your passengers, and everyone else sharing the road with you." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, allowing their gravity to sink in. Jamal responded with a slight, deliberate shrug of his shoulders, a dismissive gesture meant to convey his indifference to the proceedings. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his sneakers making a soft scuffing sound on the polished floor. "I need you to help me understand what happened that evening," the judge pressed, leaning forward slightly on the bench. His voice remained even, but carried an undeniable authority that demanded a genuine response. "The camera records what happened, but it doesn't tell me why." Jamal's eyes narrowed slightly, and he finally lifted his gaze to meet the judge's. "I was just driving home from my friend's house," he said, his words clipped and defensive. "The light was still yellow when I entered the intersection. It changed faster than I expected. That's the whole story." His explanation felt rehearsed, too simple and clean for the complexity of emotions swirling in the room. Eleanor Williams shook her head almost imperceptibly, a single tear escaping down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly with a trembling hand, hoping nobody had noticed. Judge Caprio saw the movement, saw the unspoken truth in her anguished expression, and understood that Jamal's version of events was incomplete. The real conflict here wasn't about a traffic signal timing. It was about whatever remained unsaid between this mother and son, simmering beneath the surface of their tense interaction. Judge Caprio settled back into his high-backed leather chair, the material creaking softly with his movement. He maintained his steady gaze on Jamal, reading the mixture of defiance and anxiety in the young man's posture. The courtroom remained hushed, spectators leaning forward slightly, sensing that this routine traffic case was about to reveal deeper layers. "The camera provides us with factual evidence," the judge began, his voice calm but penetrating. "It shows us the what, the when, and the where. But I'm more interested in the why tonight. Help me understand, Jamal. What was happening that made you proceed through that intersection without adequate time to stop safely?" Jamal shifted his weight again, his hands still buried deep in his hoodie pockets. He glanced briefly at the court reporter, then back at the floor. "I already told you," he said, a note of irritation creeping into his voice. "I wasn't in any special hurry. The light just changed quicker than I thought it would. It happens." He delivered this explanation with a practiced casualness that didn't quite reach his eyes, which flickered with uncertainty. Beside the podium, Eleanor Williams made a small, distressed sound in her throat. Another tear traced a path down her cheek, and this time she didn't bother to wipe it away. Her shoulders slumped forward as if carrying a heavy weight, and her breathing became visibly more rapid. The judge observed her reaction carefully, recognizing the signs of a parent grappling with something more significant than a traffic ticket. "Ms. Williams," Judge Caprio said, turning his attention to her with a gentler tone. "Would you please come stand beside your son at the podium? I think we might need your perspective on this matter." Eleanor stood immediately, smoothing her simple dress with nervous hands as she moved to join Jamal. She positioned herself close to him, their arms almost touching, but Jamal deliberately angled his body away, creating a visible distance between them. He stared resolutely ahead, his jaw set in a stubborn line. "Jamal," the judge said firmly, "look at your mother. Really look at her." The teenager hesitated, his defiance warring with the judge's command. After a long moment, he slowly turned his head, his eyes reluctantly meeting his mother's. What he saw there seemed to affect him more than any lecture or fine could have. Eleanor Williams looked at her son with such profound concern and love that even his armored posture softened slightly. Eleanor reached out a tentative hand toward her son's arm, but Jamal stiffened and she withdrew, clasping her hands together instead. Her fingers twisted anxiously around each other, a physical manifestation of the turmoil she felt. Judge Caprio watched this silent interaction closely, understanding that the traffic violation had merely been the trigger that brought a much deeper family struggle into his courtroom. The real case was just beginning to unfold. A profound silence settled over the courtroom, so complete that the hum of the ventilation system seemed suddenly loud. Every person in the chamber focused on the mother and son standing together yet apart at the defendant's podium. The tension between them was palpable, a living thing that seemed to vibrate in the air. Judge Caprio directed his next question specifically to Jamal, his voice measured but insistent. "Your mother's reaction suggests she knows something more about this incident than you've shared with us. Is there another part to this story that we haven't heard yet?" Jamal's earlier confidence visibly began to fracture. His shoulders, which had been held in a defiant square, now slumped forward. The hoodie that had felt like armor now seemed to swallow his diminishing frame. "No," he answered, but the word lacked conviction, coming out as barely more than a whisper. "Are you certain?" The judge pressed gently but firmly. "Because the tears your mother is crying right now tell me there's more happening here than a simple misjudgment about a traffic light's timing." Eleanor made another soft, choked sound, pressing her hand more firmly against her mouth as if to physically contain her emotion. Her eyes never left her son's face, and in them was a mixture of love, worry, and something else. Disappointment, perhaps, or fear. Jamal saw his mother's distress, and his own expression underwent a gradual transformation. The mask of teenage indifference began to slip, revealing the concerned son beneath. His eyes, which had flashed with defiance moments earlier, now showed uncertainty and dawning comprehension of the pain he was causing. "Something compelled you to rush through that intersection, Jamal," Judge Caprio continued, his tone thoughtful. "It might have been lateness or distraction or something else entirely. But whatever it was, I suspect it's connected to what's causing your mother such visible concern right now." Jamal dropped his gaze to the floor, studying the scuff marks on his sneakers as if they held some profound answer. His hands emerged from his pockets for the first time, hanging limp and helpless at his sides. His fingers twitched nervously, and he seemed to be struggling with some internal conflict. The judge remained quiet, allowing the silence to stretch, to become a presence in the room that demanded truth. He watched Jamal's face carefully, seeing the play of emotions, resistance, shame, concern, and finally a glimmer of acceptance. The protective walls the teenager had built around himself were crumbling, brick by brick, under the weight of his mother's silent suffering and the judge's persistent but compassionate questioning. Judge Caprio's voice softened slightly, though it lost none of its authoritative quality. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench, creating a more conversational tone. "Jamal," he began, "I want you to think about something for a moment. Your mother works hard to provide for you, doesn't she?" The teenager nodded reluctantly, his eyes still fixed on the floor. His throat moved as he swallowed hard, and a muscle twitched in his jaw. "She gets up early, before the sun most days," the judge continued, painting a verbal picture of Eleanor's daily life. "She makes sure you have breakfast, that you have everything you need for school. She puts in long hours at her job, comes home tired, and still manages to take care of household responsibilities. She puts your needs ahead of her own, doesn't she?" Another nod, this time more definite. Jamal's shoulders tightened, and he blinked rapidly, fighting against the emotions welling up inside him. Parents make those sacrifices, Caprio said, his words measured and deliberate. They do it willingly, out of love. They don't ask for thanks or recognition, but they do hope for respect and for their children to understand the value of their efforts. Eleanor began crying openly now, silent tears streaming down her face unchecked. She made no effort to wipe them away, as if she no longer had the energy to hide her emotions. Her body trembled slightly with the force of her quiet sobs. The judge turned his attention to her, his expression compassionate. "Ms. Williams, would you mind sharing with the court what you do for work?" "I'm a home health aide," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I care for elderly patients in their homes. I help them with bathing, dressing, meals." "Those are long hours, I imagine," Caprio asked gently. She nodded, wiping at her tears with a trembling hand. "Very long. Sometimes 12-hour shifts, sometimes double shifts when they're short-staffed. I go from one patient to another, then come home to—" Her voice broke and she couldn't finish the sentence. Jamal listened to his mother's testimony, his head still bowed but his posture changing. The reality of his mother's daily struggles, the exhaustion, the dedication, the selflessness, was sinking in, dismantling his defensive attitude piece by piece. The emotional weight in the room grew almost tangible, pressing down on everyone present. Jamal's transformation from defiant teenager to remorseful son was nearly complete. His earlier bravado replaced by the sober understanding of how his actions affected the person who sacrificed most for him. Mother and son stood together in heavy silence, the space between them now charged with a different kind of energy, one of shared emotion and impending reconciliation. The air in the courtroom felt thick, almost difficult to breathe, as every spectator watched the drama unfold. Even the bailiffs had softened their normally stern expressions, moved by the raw humanity on display. Judge Caprio looked at Jamal with serious, compassionate eyes. He allowed the moment to stretch, understanding its significance. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the still room. "Jamal, looking at your mother right now, seeing what this is costing her, do you have something you want to say to her?" Jamal turned slowly, almost painfully toward Eleanor. His face had gone pale, and the earlier defiance had completely vanished, replaced by a vulnerable sincerity. His hands shook slightly at his sides, and he seemed to be gathering courage for what came next. When he spoke, his voice was raw and thick with emotion. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, the words heartfelt and genuine. "I'm really, truly sorry." Eleanor didn't hesitate. She reached for her son, pulling him into a tight, desperate embrace that seemed to contain all the worry, fear, and love she'd been carrying. Her tears fell onto his hoodie, darkening the fabric. But she didn't care. She held him as if she could absorb all his troubles through that contact, her hands moving in soothing circles on his back. Jamal initially stood stiffly in her arms, then gradually relaxed, his own arms coming up to return the embrace, his face buried in her shoulder. The courtroom remained utterly still, respecting this powerful moment of connection and forgiveness. No one coughed, no papers rustled, no chairs creaked. The hug between mother and son communicated more than words ever could: apology, forgiveness, love, and the promise of a new understanding. Judge Caprio watched them for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he picked up the traffic citation that had started this entire proceeding. He examined it briefly, as if weighing its importance against the profound human moment he had just witnessed. Reaching for his stamp, he pressed it firmly onto the paper. The sound echoed through the quiet room, a definitive period at the end of this emotional story. "Case dismissed," he announced, his voice clear and final. He offered no further explanation or lecture. The embrace between mother and son had been the real resolution, the true verdict in this case. The message about responsibility, family, and love needed no elaboration. It hung in the air, settling in the hearts of everyone present long after the courtroom had emptied and the next case was called.